Palestine relationship is very special with the countries of Africa, especially the people who have suffered from the fetters of the colonial powers and from the oppression of the warmongers. These nations that have passed through these conditions know well the suffering of the Palestinian people, and that's why they consider the Palestinian cause as theirs. For more on this topic, I have with me from Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe, Mr. Robson Musrafo, the head of the Zimbabwe Palestine Friendship Committee. Welcome to our program, Mr. Robson.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Robson, as I said, that the nations that suffered from the fetters of the colonial powers and the oppression from the warmongers support the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people because they feel what oppression means and how important freedom is. So tell me about the Zimbabwe Palestine Friendship Committee activities in support of the Palestinian people in your country and around Africa, please.
Zimbabwe, particularly Zimbabwe, has had diplomatic relations with Palestine since 1983, basically 3 years after we got independent ourselves from occupation by Britain. And the relationship has been very strong when we talk about government-to-government cooperation between the government of Zimbabwe and that of Palestine. And if I talk about people-to-people relations, we understand the Palestinian people very well. And I always tell my colleagues that Palestine and Zimbabwe are not different because we share the same history. We were occupied by Britain in 1890. It took us 90 years to fight them and got independent after 90 years. And yourself, Palestine was occupied in 1948. And you are now in the 72nd year fighting that aggression. And of course, we have to admit that you have a very strong enemy on your soil, and Palestine needs our support. So this support is there. The people of Zimbabwe are very much behind you. They stand with the Palestinian people in your struggle for independence.
Yeah, you talked about the British colonial power and their occupation of your country. And here the suffering of the Palestinians is a result of Balfour Declaration by the British government at that time. So when you watch the media outlets and you see the features of the apartheid system imposed by the Israeli colonial power on the Palestinian, what you remember, or can you draw a comparison between what your country experienced during the apartheid and what Palestine is going through at these difficult times these days?
When we talk about occupation, we are talking about the issue of land, where the occupying force drives the native owners of the land and they convert it to their own use. This is exactly what we went through under occupation by Britain, where we were driven away from our own land, we were made landless in our country, we could not have access to all our resources, from land to minerals to water resources, and etc. And this was occupied by Britain. Palestine is going through the same under the occupying force, the Israeli occupying force that was brought in by Britain, basically, right from the start in 1917, when we look at the Balfour Declaration that was signed in Britain to authorize Europeans to come to Palestine to take new land. So we have serious these similarities between Palestine and Zimbabwe historically when it comes to the issue of occupation. So we know the pain of occupation, and we know the pain you are going through because we have gone through it ourselves. I know that South Africa is usually given as an example in Africa for having experienced the apartheid on the hands of the Europeans in that country. But we share the border with South Africa, and we share the same system that was in South Africa was also here. So
yes, Robson, talking about South Africa, and we know how the BDS, the Boycott, Sanctions and Divestment Movement, helped the people of South Africa to defeat the apartheid regime at that time. So if we talk about the BDS today, which stands with the Palestinian people against the Israeli occupation, to what extent this can be activated in the African continent?
Africa should be easy when it comes to understanding that and the need to boycott the occupying force of Israel in your country and uphold BDS by boycotting and avoiding normalizing relations with that occupying force. It should be easy because we have the experience on hand. I think that as we move on now, we have seen some African countries relaxing this. Actually, in a way, I would say betraying the Palestinian cause, because by establishing relations with Israel, the support for the struggle of the Palestinian people to freedom is going to be weakened a little bit. It's something that we also need to revisit and hold conferences and confront African governments who have actually shown some interest in having relations with Israel. And that is a war crime, to establish a relation with a country which is not a country actually when it's existing on stolen land. So I think that we have to increase this solidarity activism. We need to increase cooperation with African countries by actually visiting and talking to them, holding conferences, inviting them to present their position as in terms of their foreign policy towards Palestine. Because without the support of Africa, Palestine is going to have a very difficult time getting independent. I know eventually you will get independent, but we want Africa to do its part by supporting the occupied Palestinian people. Palestine is the only country at this point which is under serious occupation and apartheid.
Yeah, this is really what I want to talk with you about. The Israeli government, and mainly the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, always brags about his government ability to go to some African countries and normalize relations with the governments there. Do you think that the activities you organize, your committee, and other activists in Africa in general, in support of the Palestinian national cause, to what extent it's possible, or if there is enough space to convince these governments to back down and not to go ahead with such kind of normalization and such kind of relations with the occupying power of Israel?
It is the responsibility of our people here to remind our governments that whatever Israel brings to Africa and as aid to try and weaken our solidarity for Palestine, our support for the Palestinian people, is actually coming from America. Because the American government is the one that is actually driving all this aggression against the Palestinian people. And it's giving Israel this financial aid massively, and which aid is then being used by the same Israel to come to Africa, especially to other countries in Africa which have some weaknesses in terms of economic ability to handle their requirements for their population, and using money to try to turn them into supporting and normalizing relations with the occupation. We need to talk about this one, and I think African countries can have better friends among other countries, among other people who have not normalized relations with the Israeli force. It's not going to do us any favor at all by establishing relations with Israel at the demise of the democracy, the demise of our support that we need to keep giving to the Palestinian people until they are as free as we are. So honestly, the civil societies and other organizations and other very strong governments and countries in Africa, like South Africa, as I said, should also do their part. The AU do their part within SADC structures and then the United Nations to make sure that those countries in Africa that tend to negate their pledge, to negate their responsibility to support Palestine, can actually go back and redraft their foreign policy towards Israel. It's not a good thing to normalize relations with Israel when it's an occupying force in Palestine.
Yeah, Mr. Robson, of course, we strongly believe that a friend in need is a friend indeed, and we have a trust in our friends in Africa, in Zimbabwe, and around the world that with their support, the occupation one day will be defeated. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your intervention.
Thank you very much for the time you have given us to share with you our resentment of the situation you are going through in Palestine. We will not leave you alone. We will continue to support you because we know you need to be free like us, and global peace can only be possible when Palestine is also free. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please follow up us on our Facebook page, PIP. And for now, from me, Osama Nazal, thank you very much for watching and goodbye.